In March 2011, a man confessed to murder on Facebook. He named his victim, his 15-year-old stepsister. He turned himself in. Was extradited. Interrogated for 5 days. Then they released him. Because he didn't do it. He had lied, risked everything, his freedom, his life, to solve a case that had been cold for 16 years. This is Cold Case Beacon. If this is your first time here, you've just stepped into one of the most desperate gambles in criminal justice history. Cold Case Beacon exists to illuminate the forgotten, the unsolved, and the cases that refuse to fade. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's begin. Nicole van den Hurk was born July 4, 1980, in Erkrath, a small town in western Germany. Shortly after, her mother Angelica married Ad van den Hurk, a Dutchman, and the family relocated to the Netherlands. Nicole took her stepfather's name. For a time, life appeared stable. But by 1989, when Nicole was just 9 years old, the marriage had fractured beyond repair. Angelica and Ad divorced. Custody was awarded to Ad, and Nicole moved in with him, his new wife Yolanda, and her stepbrother Andy. She adjusted as well as any child could. Maintained relationships with both families. Visited her mother in Germany when circumstances allowed. Then, in early 1995, tragedy arrived without warning. Angelica died by suicide. Nicole was 14. Those who knew her said she carried the grief quietly, the way children often do when they have no other choice. She didn't withdraw. She kept attending school. Kept spending time with friends. That same year, she took a part-time job at a bakery in a shopping center near her home in Eindhoven. By October, she was living with her grandmother, though she remained close to her father and stepmother. Her life had developed a rhythm, school during the week, shifts at the bakery on weekends, and whatever small freedoms a 15-year-old could carve out for herself. She was, by all accounts, an ordinary teenager navigating an ordinary life. Friday, October 6, 1995, began like any other morning. Nicole left her grandmother's house just after dawn, heading to her shift at the bakery. The ride was less than 2 miles, a route she had taken dozens of times before. But that morning, she never arrived. When she failed to show up for work, concern spread quickly. By evening, her family had contacted police. A specialized unit of 15 officers was formed immediately, and a search of the surrounding area began. By 6 o'clock that same day, they had found her bicycle. It was submerged in the Dommel River, near a water treatment plant on the outskirts of the city. Within hours, a dive team was sent down to search the riverbed. They surfaced empty-handed. Over the next several days, detectives fanned out across Eindhoven. They interviewed family members, friends, teachers, classmates. They retraced Nicole's movements in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, searching for signs of conflict, for motive, for anything that might explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No enemies. No fights. No indication of trouble at home or school. Authorities stated publicly that while they couldn't rule out foul play, they couldn't confirm it either. The investigation was moving forward, but the trail was already growing cold. 3 days after Nicole vanished, the case took an unexpected turn. 5 minors were arrested on charges of public violence. They had been terrorizing cyclists and pedestrians along the Valkansebaan, a route that cuts through part of Eindhoven, the same route Nicole would have taken that morning. What drew investigators' attention even further was the fact that several of the arrested youths attended Nicole's school. They knew her. Riot police were brought in. A 45-officer platoon swept through the Eckhart Forest, a stretch of woodland behind the treatment plant where her bicycle had been recovered. A plane was deployed to search bodies of water from above. Students were re-interviewed, one by one. 15 new tips came in. And then the investigation began to fracture. They searched everything, water, woods, sewers, even consulted psychics out of desperation, and still found nothing. By early November, with no physical evidence and no clear suspect, authorities floated a new theory: maybe Nicole had simply run away. A man claimed he'd seen a girl matching her description at a petrol station near the German border on the day she vanished. Detectives suggested she might be alive somewhere, living of her own accord. Her father, Ad, rejected it outright. Her German grandmother held on to cautious hope, telling reporters Nicole might be somewhere she felt safe and happy. That hope shattered on November 22, 1995. A hiker walking through a wooded area between the villages of Lierop and Mierlo discovered the body of a teenage girl. It was Nicole. The autopsy revealed what no family should ever have to hear. Her jaw had been fractured in 2 places. There were wounds to her head. And on her fingers, defensive injuries, evidence that she had fought for her life. She had been raped. The wound that killed her was a single stab to the ribs, driven deep enough to pierce vital organs. For 7 weeks, she had been lying in those woods, exposed to the elements, alone, waiting to be found. Nicole's funeral was held on November 28, 1995. Approximately 1,000 people attended. The grief in that chapel was suffocating. The anger, even more so. By January of the following year, just 2 months after her body was discovered, the investigation had already begun to shrink. The team of 15 officers was reduced to 4. Their sole task was to follow up on any new tips that might still trickle in. But the case had gone quiet. The trail had gone cold. In February of 1996, the case briefly resurfaced under bizarre circumstances. A teenage girl from Eindhoven was arrested in Miami, Florida, on charges of drug smuggling. During her interrogation, she made a startling claim: she knew who had murdered Nicole van den Hurk. According to her story, she had been coerced into smuggling drugs by a criminal gang based in Eindhoven, and this same gang, she alleged, was involved in Nicole's death. When word of this reached the Netherlands, Nicole's father, Ad, stated publicly that he knew the girl and believed her. But police were skeptical. By late March, investigators announced that they had found no evidence to support her claims. Her account, they said, did not hold up under scrutiny. The lead was abandoned. Then, on May 22, 1996, the investigation lurched in a new and devastating direction. Nicole's stepbrother, Andy van den Hurk, was arrested on suspicion of involvement in her murder. He was detained, interrogated for 5 days, and held under intense scrutiny by investigators who were convinced they had finally found their suspect. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No forensic match. No credible testimony. After 5 days, he was released and formally ruled out. Less than 3 weeks later, on June 7, the focus shifted once again. This time, authorities arrested Nicole's father, Ad van den Hurk. Like his son before him, Ad was questioned for 6 days before being released. He, too, was ruled out. For Ad, the damage was irreparable. In interviews conducted years later, he spoke openly about the toll the accusations had taken on him and his family. He described the media frenzy that followed his arrest, the way suspicion clung to him like a stain that wouldn't wash out. At first, he said, he had tried to use the attention to keep Nicole's case in the public eye, hoping that if her name stayed in the news, someone might come forward with information. But over time, bitterness set in. In a 2005 interview with the Eindhoven Dagblad newspaper, he was blunt in his assessment. The failure to solve Nicole's murder, he said, was 100% the fault of the investigators. He accused them of being so fixated on him and his family that the real killer had been allowed to slip away, free to erase all traces of the crime. He told reporters he had gone into the woods at night with a flashlight, searching for his daughter while police wasted time building a case against the wrong people. Andy, for his part, took a more measured view of what had happened. In later interviews, he acknowledged that at the time of Nicole's disappearance, he had been in a bad place. He was drinking heavily, running with the wrong crowd, and refusing to fully cooperate with investigators. So when they came for him, he said, it wasn't entirely a shock. By 2005, Andy had turned his life around. He was living and working in Stevenage, England, far from the chaos of his past. His father, Ad, had also moved on, relocating to Benidorm, Spain, after his budding music career collapsed and his marriage to Yolanda fell apart in the aftermath of Nicole's death. For 15 years, Nicole's case sat untouched. It was briefly re-examined in 2004 by a cold case team, but they found no new angles to pursue. No overlooked evidence. No fresh leads. The file was closed once again, and the case returned to silence. Nicole's killer, whoever they were, remained free. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And then, in March of 2011, everything changed. On March 8, Andy van den Hurk sat down at his computer in his home in Stevenage, England, and opened Facebook. What he did next would shock a nation and reignite a case that had been cold for 16 years. He wrote a confession. In the post, he stated clearly and publicly that he had murdered his stepsister, Nicole van den Hurk, back in 1995. He said he was ready to turn himself in. The post went live. Within hours, it had been reported to authorities. Several weeks later, on March 30th, he was arrested by British police, extradited to the Netherlands, and placed in an interrogation room where investigators pressed him for details. For 5 days, they questioned him. For 5 days, he maintained his story. And then, after 5 days, they released him. Because there was no evidence. No forensic link. No physical proof. No credible detail in his confession that only the killer would know. The only thing tying Andy van den Hurk to Nicole's murder was the Facebook post itself. And that, investigators determined, was not enough. Following his release, Andy did something even more surprising. He recanted the entire confession. He explained to reporters that he had not killed Nicole. He had never harmed her. The confession, he said, had been a lie. A calculated, desperate gamble. He had confessed to murder because he wanted to force the authorities to reopen the case. And more specifically, he wanted them to exhume Nicole's body, because after 16 years in the ground, her remains might still hold the one piece of evidence that could solve the case, DNA. He knew the risk. He knew that if something went wrong, if investigators found a way to twist his confession into a conviction, he could spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he did not commit. But he did it anyway. "I wanted to get her exhumed and get DNA off her," he told reporters. "I kind of set myself up, and it could have gone horribly wrong. To get her exhumed, I had to put steps in place. I went to the police and said, I did it. She is my sister. Absolutely. I miss her every day." Andy's plan worked. In September of 2011, Dutch authorities made the decision to exhume Nicole van den Hurk's body. On September 13, investigators publicly announced that DNA had been successfully extracted from her remains. The sample, they said, likely belonged to her killer. Following the announcement, Nicole's father, Ad, voluntarily submitted his own DNA for comparison, eager to assist in any way he could. Nicole's remains were reburied with dignity on November 16. The DNA analysis revealed two distinct profiles. One belonged to Nicole's boyfriend at the time of her death, which was not unexpected given their relationship. The other profile belonged to an unknown male. This was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. But it raised a critical question: who did it belong to? The cold case team assigned to Nicole's murder began to think strategically. They revisited similar crimes from the same time period, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might point them in the right direction. One case stood out. In September of 2000, a young woman in the town of Valkenswaard, located approximately 5 miles from Eindhoven, had been abducted while riding her bicycle. She had been sexually assaulted at knife point. The perpetrator had been caught, convicted, and sentenced in 2001. The lead detective on Nicole's case suggested a DNA comparison. What if the unknown profile from Nicole's body matched the DNA of the man convicted in the Valkenswaard assault? On January 14, 2014, nearly 19 years after Nicole's murder, a 46-year-old man was arrested. His DNA was a match. It matched the biological material found on Nicole's body. It matched an unidentified hair recovered from her remains. Under Dutch privacy laws, the man's name was released publicly only as a pseudonym, Jos de G. Jos de G was not an unknown quantity to law enforcement. He had 3 prior convictions for rape. For at least one of these offenses, he had been sentenced to 3 years of preventive detention and compulsory psychiatric treatment. He was a violent offender with a documented history of sexual assault. And now, his DNA had been found on the body of a 15-year-old girl who had been raped and murdered in 1995. The case against him appeared strong. But the defense was prepared to fight. They immediately challenged the validity of the DNA evidence, and their argument was straightforward: Nicole's body had been lying outside in the elements for 7 weeks before it was discovered. During that time, it had been exposed to rain, wind, insects, animals, and decomposition. The risk of contamination, they argued, was extraordinarily high. Furthermore, DNA preservation techniques in the 1990s were far more primitive than those used in the 2010s. The methods of extraction and analysis had evolved dramatically in the intervening years. Could the evidence, they asked, really be trusted? Forensic experts were brought in to examine the samples in detail. They confirmed that 2 distinct DNA profiles were visible in the evidence recovered from Nicole's body. However, some peaks in the genetic data did not match perfectly, which led the defense to make a bold claim: there was a third person's DNA present on Nicole's remains. If true, this would mean that someone else, not Jos de G, could have been responsible for her death. Experts countered that the inconsistencies in the data were not the result of a third party, but rather the result of natural degradation over time. DNA, they explained, breaks down. It fragments. It becomes harder to read. But that does not mean it is unreliable. The Dutch Supreme Court would later weigh in on the matter, categorically rejecting the defense's theory that a third person's DNA was present on Nicole's body. The court deemed it highly unlikely based on the totality of the forensic research and the investigative record. Regardless of the technical debate, one fundamental fact remained undisputed: Jos de G's DNA was on Nicole van den Herk's body. And given his history of violent sexual offenses, he was the strongest candidate for her killer. But the defense was not finished. They pivoted to a new argument. Perhaps, they suggested, Nicole had engaged in consensual sex with Jos de G at some point before her death. If that were true, it would explain the presence of his DNA without implicating him in her murder. The prosecution found this theory implausible. Nicole had been in a committed relationship with her boyfriend at the time of her death. She had a busy schedule, balancing school, work, and her social life. There was no evidence whatsoever that she had been involved with anyone else. But the mere suggestion was enough to introduce reasonable doubt into the proceedings. In response, the prosecution made a strategic decision. They dropped the murder charge against Jos de G. Instead, he was charged with rape and manslaughter. The distinction mattered. Rape could be proven with certainty: his DNA was inside her body. But proving he delivered the fatal stab wound, proving the exact timeline and circumstances of her death after 7 weeks of decomposition, was far more difficult. The prosecution chose the charges they could prove beyond doubt. Throughout the legal proceedings, Jos de G maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had never met Nicole van den Herk and had no contact with her at the time of her disappearance. But when confronted directly with the DNA evidence, his story shifted. He admitted that it was possible he had engaged in consensual sex with her at some point before she vanished. It was a vague, non-committal answer that satisfied no one. The trial began in November of 2015. But just weeks into the proceedings, it was abruptly paused. A witness had come forward with an explosive claim. The witness stated that Jos De had confessed to him years earlier. According to the witness, De had looked at him with cold, emotionless eyes and said he had killed a girl. The witness went on to describe what De had allegedly told him, that he had sex with the girl, and that she had laughed at him. She had mocked the size of his penis. And because of that humiliation, because she had ridiculed him, he had killed her. The testimony was damning. But the defense was quick to challenge its credibility. They argued that the witness was motivated by financial gain. A reward had been offered for information leading to the conviction of Nicole's killer, and the defense suggested that the witness had fabricated the confession in order to claim the money. The court took the testimony into consideration, but it was not enough to resolve the case on its own. The trial resumed and continued into 2016. That year, the DNA evidence was subjected to yet another round of analysis by independent forensic experts. In April of 2016, the court heard the results. According to the experts, it was 2.28 million times more likely than not that Jos De's DNA was one of the profiles found on Nicole van den Herk's body. The statistical probability was overwhelming. The defense's arguments about contamination and degradation had not changed the fundamental conclusion: the DNA belonged to him. In October of 2016, after nearly a year of legal proceedings, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The prosecution requested a sentence of 14 years in prison. They argued that Nicole had not consented to sex with Jos De, pointing to her stable relationship, her busy life, and the complete absence of any evidence suggesting she had been involved with him. They argued that he had raped her, brutalized her, and killed her. And they argued that he should be held fully accountable for what he had done. On November 21, 2016, the verdict was delivered. Jos De was found guilty of raping Nicole van den Herk. However, he was acquitted of the manslaughter charge. The court cited lingering questions about the possibility of a third party being involved, based on the ambiguities in the DNA evidence. Jos De was sentenced to 5 years in prison. 5 years. For the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl. The sentence was notably light, and part of the reasoning was that De had been deemed legally insane at the time of his arrest for Nicole's murder. He had been receiving psychiatric treatment in a mental health facility, and the court took this into account when determining his punishment. For Nicole's family, the verdict was devastating. 5 years felt like an insult. A mockery of justice. But the prosecution was not done fighting. Shortly after the verdict, they filed an appeal, challenging the acquittal on the manslaughter charge. They argued that the evidence was sufficient to support a conviction and that the court had erred in its judgment. The appeal case began on August 28, 2018. And in October of that year, the appeals court overturned the original verdict. Jos De was found guilty of both rape and manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The sentence was upheld by the Dutch Supreme Court in 2020, bringing the legal proceedings to a final, definitive close. After 25 years, Nicole van den Herk's case was resolved. Her killer was behind bars. But the road to that resolution had been long, painful, and marred by missteps at nearly every turn. A family had been torn apart by suspicion and false accusations. A father and son had been arrested, interrogated, and publicly vilified for a crime they did not commit. A stepbrother had risked his freedom, his reputation, and his entire future on a desperate lie, all in the hope that it would force the truth into the light. And a 15-year-old girl, who had simply climbed onto her bicycle one Friday morning to ride to work, had her life stolen in the most brutal and senseless way imaginable. Nicole van den Herk was born on July 4, 1980. She died on October 6, 1995. She was 15 years old. She left home that morning expecting a shift at a bakery. Instead, the system spent 25 years catching up. This is Cold Case Beacon. If you believe Nicole's story matters, if you believe victims deserve more than silence and families deserve more than abandonment, then subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Andy's impossible choice, on justice delayed, on what should have been done differently. And follow us, because Nicole is not the only one. There are more names we need to remember. More faces we need to see. More families still waiting for the answers we can help them find. Don't let these cases fade into the dark. Thank you for watching. Stay vigilant. And I'll see you in the next investigation.